Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I think people are still coming on, but I'm going to start because we have a wonderful program. I'm Sydney Stern, chair of the Women Writing Women's Live Seminar, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Dorothy O. Helly Works in Progress lecture, given today by Ava Chin, who will be talking about her upcoming book, Mott Street, a Chinese American family story of exclusion and homecoming, to be published by Penguin Press in April 2023. I'm sorry we can't all be together, but as much as we miss the interaction of being in a room together, it has been a pleasure to have so many people literally from all over the world attending our talks. So welcome, everybody. Before I introduce Ava, I want to give you a bit of background on Women Writing Women's Lives. We're a group of about 70 members in the New York area who are writing memoirs or biographies of women. We meet once a month from October through May, and once a year we present a Dorothy Helly Works in Progress lecture to the public. As the title indicates, our members talk about a work in progress rather than a published work. So our speakers, including Ava today, talk both about their subject and their experiences in the process of bringing their materials to life, their challenges, issues, rewards, whatever they choose to highlight. In our regular sessions, we focus on specific issues and hear from both members and outside speakers. Our group was formed in 1990 to address the particular challenges of writing about women. But over the years, we've consciously tried to advance the genres of biography and memoir in general ways as we dealt with specific issues. Our website, womenwritingwomenslives.org, all one word, includes a list of topics and presenters from the past, in case some of you belong to writers groups or readers groups and are looking for ideas. Ordinarily, at this point, I would recognize our member Dorothy Helly, for whom this series is named. It's named for Dorothy both because she conceived of the idea and because we wanted to honor her by recognizing her many years of service and Dorothy's particular contributions, both to our seminar as a group and to many of the members as individuals. So under the circumstances, Dorothy, I know you're out there. Please consider yourself publicly thanked. I also want to thank especially Susan Barilli, our member who oversees every aspect of this series, from working with our speakers to getting the word out. And Eileen Liang Massey of CUNY Center for the Study of Women in Society, who does everything. Without her, these just would not happen. I also want to thank our many co-sponsors here at City University of New York, CUNY, for this event. They are the Center for the Humanities, the Feminist Press, Leon Levy Center for Biography, the Graduate Center Master's Program in Biography and Memoir, the Master's Program in Liberal Studies, the PhD programs in History and English, and beyond co-sponsoring, our co-presenters, the Center for the Study of Women and Society, Eileen Liang Massey and Natalie Ruby, who have shepherded this presentation with finesse and attention to detail, even including the handsome graphics of the flyer. And they're behind the scenes today, continuing to help. So thank you both. Also, profuse thanks to Brad Holscher of Audiovisual Services at CUNY, whose technical expertise, patience, and good humor gets us through the ether in the best possible form. I'm sure you're all extremely familiar with Zoom by now, but because this is a webinar, some things are a bit different. Webinar is a good term. I'll have to remember that. I'm about to introduce Ava, and after she speaks, we will have a question and answer period, which can last up to 5:30. That's the time we have. If you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A section, not the chat. The chat is disabled today. You can type them in while she's speaking or afterwards while she's answering others' questions, and I'll relay as many as possible in our allotted time. We will be recording this session, and as soon as possible, we'll provide a link on our website so others can access it, or you can as well. So, okay, Ava Chin, why don't you come on, Ava, while I introduce you. Hi. Okay, let me just welcome. Ava Chin is the author of the award-winning Eating Wildly, Simon & Schuster 2014, which won the 2015 MFK Fisher Book Award. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, where she wrote the Urban Forager column, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Village Voice, and Marie Claire, among others. She's been the recipient of grants and fellowships from the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, the Fulbright U.S. Scholar Program, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the New York Institute for the Humanities, and the Asian American Writers Workshop. Ava also edited the anthology Split, Stories from a Generation Raised on Divorce, about growing up in a divorced family. Her fiction and poetry appear in Dick for a Day, It's Only Rock and Roll, Listen Up, Spoken Word Poetry, and A Gathering of the Tribes. She has performed on stages at Woodstock 94, the Whitney Museum, and the Knitting Factory. She has contributed lyrics for the alternative rock band Soul Coughing's El Oso. Ava holds a PhD from the University of Southern California, a master's from the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University, and a Bachelor of Arts from Queens College. She is an associate professor of creative nonfiction and journalism at the College of Staten Island, with a joint position at the CUNY Graduate Center's program in biography and memoir. So on with Ava and the way to Mott Street. We're looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for that lovely introduction. It's so nice to be here. I am sorry that we are not in person, but I do recognize the fact that this keeps us all safer. And it is nice to be able to have people who are not necessarily in the city itself who are able to join us. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the challenges of writing a giant family biography with multiple generations and a very wide scope, and where decades of research had to be threaded together into a single narrative, where there was both lots of material from a certain perspective on one hand, but scant archives on the other, especially regarding the lives of the women, and where sometimes the archives themselves were so prickly and contained such vitriol against people who looked like me and my family members that some days it felt like I had just simply entered a landmine. So, okay. I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Mott Street, which is a nonfiction narrative about the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws on 4 generations of my family in New York's Chinatown as they attempted to lay down roots in America. The book revolves around a building on the intersection of Mott and Pell in the heart of old Chinatown, where so many generations of my family lived, great-grandparents, grandparents, my father and his cousins and his generation, and then finally ourselves. In order to explain the genesis of how this book came about, you need to know a little bit about me. I am a 5th generation Chinese American New Yorker, raised by a single mother in Flushing, Queens. When I was growing up, I was surrounded by so many family secrets, and I had so many questions. The first was, who was my elusive father and this family I was estranged from? Why did people only ever speak about them in whispers? And were they really big wigs in Chinatown? Next, why was the grandfather who raised me a fabulous gourmand who cooked up amazing meals for the family and who regaled me since childhood about stories of our railroad ancestor who helped build the greatest engineering marvel of the 19th century, the Transcontinental Railroad? Why was my grandfather living here under a false alias? Was my grandfather illegal? But how could he be illegal when his grandfather helped build this amazing infrastructure in the 19th century that helped unite the country? And then lastly, how come as a 5th generation Chinese American, I was such an anomaly on the East Coast? Why did I almost never meet another Asian American like myself who had such deep family roots in so many generations in this country? And on the very rare occasion when I did, why was it that we would invariably discover that we were in fact related, like somebody's idea of a very bad joke? So all roads led me down to two major points. Hold on one second. Two major points. I want to share my screen. All right. Okay. So it led me to several points, two major points. The Chinese Exclusion Act laws of 1882 to 1943. The Chinese Exclusion laws are the country's first majorly restrictive immigration laws in the United States. It effectively halted legal Chinese immigration and blocked a pathway towards our citizenship for over 60 years. It also set the tone for future immigration restrictions going forward. So by 1924, all Asians, with the exception of Filipinos, are not allowed to come legally into the country. And that small caveat I can tell you about a little bit later. So here are the different iterations of the Chinese Exclusion Act laws. I'm going to try to go back to this in a minute. But the Chinese Exclusion Act laws was one major point of interest. The other major point of interest was a single tenement apartment building on Mott Street in the heart of New York's Chinatown, where both sides of my family became upstairs, downstairs neighbors from each other, friends, lovers, sworn enemies, and eventually, through my own birth, family kin. We have lived continuously in this building for over 100 years. It is where I wrote the majority of this book and is where I am speaking to you from today. So Mott Street is a family biography memoir weaving together the stories of so many generations of my family, but it's told from my particular point of view. I trace their origins from southern China to the backbreaking labor of the Transcontinental Railroad and the brutalities of frontier town racism. What ended up happening after the gold rush and after the completion of the railroad was a major economic depression that roiled across the country. And sometimes, as we know only too well, when economic strife occurs, sometimes the seeds of unrest and violence can happen. And so this time period, the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s were very difficult time for Chinese Americans. It was a time, we call it the Pai Hua. You can think about it as expulsions against Chinese. You can also think about it in terms of pogroms against Chinese. And so I trace their journey through the West to where they eventually land in New York City, where my family members became merchants, civic leaders, and heads of the Chinese tongue. Throughout the course of the narrative, I even reunited with my father for the first time in 27 years. But I soon discovered that exclusion is not just a political act, but it is something that can be deeply personal as well, even within your own family. So I want to just go back over, just for a second, the laws. So when we talk about Chinese exclusion is on the books from 1882 to 1943. But the seeds of exclusion were sown at least 12 years prior to that. And so one of the things I needed to do when I was doing this research was to really understand what were the conditions that fostered Chinese exclusion in the first place. And I was able to uncover that with the Naturalization Act of 1870, which did not mention on purpose Chinese Americans and Asians to have a pathway towards naturalization and citizenship. And then the very difficult for us Page Act of 1875, which made the immigration of Asian women into this country incredibly difficult, so difficult that most women did not come over. So all of these things in combination to Chinese exclusion being on the books, gives you a sense of that Chinese exclusion actually started occurring way before 1882. I will also say that after 1943, the Chinese were allowed to have a quota to come into this country, but the quota was so stingy, it was only 105 per year, that it effectively made Chinese exclusion continue until the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. So we say that Chinese exclusion existed for 60, 61 years. In fact, it's closer to 100. All right, so with that in mind, one of the biggest challenges that I faced was not just in terms of doing the research, which I will talk to you more about, but it was really an internal process. This book was daunting. This book was gigantic. For me, this was that book. And when I say that book, I think many of you who are watching today can understand what I'm talking about, right? That book that you have rattling around in the back of your head that you've always wanted to write, that book that you've been collecting details and stories and documents all throughout the years with the intention of writing it, that book that, you know, is so perfect in your head, but maybe every time you try to write about it, the writing just falls flat. You don't have the right parameters. You don't have the right frame. For whatever reasons, the writing just does not sail, right? And so for me, this impossible book started to make me question myself, right? So some of those questions were, well, who are you? Who are you to write that book? What makes you think that you can do that? This book is going to take years off of your life. You don't have that time, those resources. You're maybe illiterate, maybe in that language. Maybe you don't have the language skills that you need in order to do the research. Maybe you don't have the resources, right? And maybe you think to yourself, there are people who don't even want to talk to you. So how can you actually write that book, right? So maybe you're like me, you do other things. You go to graduate school, you land a tenure-track teaching job, you get tenure. Maybe you get married, or maybe you don't. Maybe you have a baby. Maybe you even write other books, because at least in your head, those things are easier to do than writing that book. Along the way, you make little projects, smaller books, art installations, essays. You write stories, all things that pertain to that book that's in your head, right? And maybe you're lucky that you can show some of these things either in a gallery, a group gallery show, or you publish these things online. Perhaps you even find a rare book, an ethnography, the first ethnography of New York's Chinatown, written by Louis Beck and published in 1898. Maybe that book comes your way. Maybe you look in that book and you see a profile of somebody in your family, and you ask your family members about it, and then you find out more information, and you write down those notes and you file it away, but you don't do anything more about it because it is still simply feels impossible, right? But then perhaps one day something starts to shift. Maybe a series of events unfolds that it's almost as if the universe is sending you signs. So perhaps a reporter from the Forward newspaper, this is the profile that was in this book. And maybe the reporter from the Forward newspaper reaches out to you, telling you about how your family member took part in New York City fundraisers for Kishinev pogrom victims in 1903. Who knew, right? Oh, hold on one second, sorry. Perhaps a colleague at NYU makes an introduction to you that opens the door to your finding and finally acquiring an oral history that has taken you 20 years to get your hands on. Perhaps that happens. Perhaps you attend an exhibit at the New York Historical Society, and the exhibit is on Chinese American exclusion and inclusion. And perhaps there are images there in this exhibit, images of the work that your family members did back in the 19th century, the Chinese Equal Rights League, trying to fight exclusion, the extension of exclusion in the courts. Perhaps you even see places, images of the places where they were detained when they first came into the country. And perhaps even you see your great-grandfather's Chinese Exclusion Act ID papers hanging on the wall. Maybe it's there that you meet the author of Black Gotham, Carla Peterson, who you tell your idea of that book to, and she says to you, why don't you come to a meeting of the Women Writing Women's Lives seminar, right? There are lots of wonderful community, it's a wonderful community of writers there. So perhaps all of those things happen. And when they do, all of a sudden, and this is really important, suddenly everything changes. Suddenly a frame becomes visible, right? This frame that can encompass all of your family stories that you've been collecting through the years, the frame that answers so many of the questions that has been dogging you since childhood. And within that frame, you can finally see it and look at that book and say, all right, I will do it. I will make a commitment. This is the sole project that I will work on for the next 5 to 7 years. And perhaps you will drag your family across the globe to do the research for this book. Perhaps you may not have another child because this book is important, and ultimately you realize that it's worth it. Some of the central questions for this book that the book addresses are, what happens when a young country starts asking itself, who is an American and who is not? Who is one of us and who is not? What happens when during the era of Reconstruction, when the country is attempting to build anew, when elected officials on the West Coast who are decidedly anti-Chinese work with entrenched Southern politicians who are intent upon maintaining supremacy? What happens when they strike deals with each other? And they strike deals to close down the border for the very first time in order to keep people from your family's country of origin, people who look like you, out. And then later, not just a very large country, but the entire continent is excluded from immigration. What happens when these electeds create, in the mid-19th century, the longest running and most restrictive immigration laws in the country to date? What does it mean for us as a nation today? And what does it say about us going forward? How does it make us vulnerable as a population to politicians stoking fires against the other for their own political gain? How does it make us vulnerable to divisions that are stoked among us and blind to the contributions of a significant portion of the population? Let me talk to you a little bit more about the research. Okay. So remember that journalist from the Forward newspaper who reached out to me? When he reached out to me, he told me there were files on my family member, the one that he was reaching out about, the one that had taken part in the New York City fundraisers for pogrom victims. He told me that there were files at the National Archives office, and this was the first time I realized that such an archive existed. He sent me my uncle Dek Foon's file, which he then scanned. He got scanned from the National Archives offices in New York and Lower Manhattan. Now, the silver lining to Chinese exclusion is that there are files that are on all of Chinese who came over during the exclusion period. And these files offer a wealth of information that were updated whenever anybody left the country and then tried to come in. All right, whether it was to visit, other countries for business or to visit home. Um, Whenever they had to, it also encompassed whenever they had to check in with an officer in order to get a certificate of ID, which only Chinese had to carry at risk of deportation and hard labor. And the Chinese Exclusion Act files follow the whereabouts of Chinese in this country for the duration of their lives or the end of exclusion, whichever came first. And again, that official end of exclusion, the repeal, is 1943. I've even seen files on family members that were born here and by rights are American citizens, right? So let me tell you a little bit about some of the family members that I deal with. And again, it's a constellation of people. And I had to make an executive decision on who to focus on and who, unfortunately, didn't make the cut in this book. So hold on one second. So pictured here, you remember in the very first photograph that I showed was a family portrait. And I apologize, I think I went through that slide very quickly. But this is my grandmother's, my maternal grandmother's side of the family. And pictured here on the left is Dec Foon. Dec Foon was the first person in her family to come over in 1885. He lived out west for a year in the height of the anti-Chinese, the Pai Hua expulsion period. Excuse me. I should say a background, well, maybe I already went over this a little bit. A background note about the expulsions. The expulsions happened after I mentioned this already, the gold rush and the completion of the railroad, which then after that followed a Great Depression. This ushered in a tsunami of hatred that resulted in over 200 towns in California pushing out their Chinese residents. Many of these towns had hundreds of Chinese residents living in them, so you can do the math there. It was not only limited to California, it also happened in Washington State, in Colorado, in Idaho, where the state population was 30% Chinese, and it was where other family members of mine did get pushed out, but I don't have enough time to talk about that right now. It's just important that you know that Dec Foon was living out in California at that time. He read the newspaper articles, he saw the ways that Chinese people out west were being treated. He saw the handwriting on the wall and he left. He was married and he had a son. He came out to America basically because there had been a famine, people were starving, he needed to support his family, so he was able to cobble together the money to come over. And so he comes in really in the earliest days of exclusion. His files were kind of difficult to find because again, the reporter from the Forward was able to give me one file, but it turned out that his files were scattered all across the country. Again, he was married before. He becomes a widower while he is in New York. To his right, to his left, to our right, is his second wife, Elva. Elva was the daughter of a Civil War veteran from Pennsylvania. She also was married before. Elva is harboring a secret that wasn't revealed until I was able to track down her brother's descendants. She herself had no children. They had no children together. All right. And it took it took 2 years of scouring ancestry family trees, leaving messages that went unanswered. I finally finally just broke down and did what our undergrads do, which is I did a Google search, and I did a white pages directory search, and I was finally able to get a hold of extended family members. This secret surrounding Elva swirled around her family for generations until it reached my ears. And I cannot reveal what that secret is. You'll just have to read the book. All right. When Uncle Deck and Aunt Elva got married in 1902, it was the same year that Chinese exclusion was made permanent. No Chinese was allowed to naturalize, and 5 years later, the Expatriation Act was enacted. Now, the Expatriation Act was a law. It's not, I put it on that list. It's not necessarily like a Chinese Exclusion Act law per se, but because Aunt Elva married my uncle who was Chinese, it affects her, okay? So the Expatriation Act law was a law, it was a very quiet law that kind of, they kind of snuck it in, and many American women were not aware of the fact that it had happened. This law stated that American women who married foreigners took on the citizenship of their husbands. Now, the background to this was that politicians were arguing about the issues of citizenship, and they didn't want Americans to have dual citizenship. Also, women who married, outside of, who married foreigners, could be viewed as traitors, right? And so this law is enacted. Now, even though Deck and Elva got married before the act came into law, the law was retroactive. So it was in 1907 that in the eyes of our government, Aunt Elva becomes Chinese. She even has a Chinese Exclusion Act file, which I was able to find in Boston. The couple had lived in Boston for about 10 years. And oftentimes, it's sort of you have to run around and try to figure out, like, where do these files exist. The Chinese Exclusion Act files generally exist in the area in which the person resided. Now, Deck and Elva lived in New York City, but for 10 years they lived in Boston. And so a Chinese Exclusion Act file was started for Elva. And let's see. Here's the other thing. When the Expatriation Act was altered, it wasn't completely repealed, but it was altered with the Cable Act law. When that law occurred, even despite the fact that this helped a lot of American women not have to change their citizenship or have their citizenship changed on them, and Elva still couldn't naturalize until some 40 years later. So here's her Chinese Exclusion Act file. It starts in 1922, around the time when the couple decides to go to China for the first time. Uncle Deck takes Elva out of the country. It's her first time out of the country. They go to Hong Kong. They go to the villages in Guangdong province, where our family originally hails from. And then in the 1929 to 1930 and 31, they go back to China again. And so on the right-hand side, you see a photograph of an older Elva, right? And that is from her file from when they go to China again. The couple had decided that they wanted to retire in China. Deck's only son from the first marriage, that son was in Hong Kong. They decided that they wanted to, and he had a family, they decided they wanted to be back. Make a long story short, it doesn't work out. When they decide to come back home to New York, my family was very happy to have them. As you can see on the bottom, I don't know if you can make out that script, but you can see it says the date in which they arrived in January in 1932. it says aliens admitted, primary inspection, blah, 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 right? So for me, it was always very shocking to see Elva, who is the daughter of a Civil War Army veteran of the Union Army, discussed as an alien or as a Chinese. Okay. Let's see. So Chinese exclusion was so restrictive that most people could not get in the country legally. But something happened in 1906. For many of you who remember your American history, what natural disaster happens in 1906 but the San Francisco earthquake erupts? It's the worst natural disaster in California history. Its reverberations can be felt all the way from Oregon down south to south of Los Angeles. One of the most important things for us that happens is that the City Hall of Records burns down. The City Hall of Records that contains the birth certificates of 49ers, of all different kinds of Californians who are living there. And once that building and those records go up in smoke, that's when a great fissure arrives in the wall of Chinese exclusion, allowing Chinese to finally be able to enter by way of false aliases through something called the Paper Son Network. It creates paper fathers and paper children, right? And this is something that was incredibly important for most of us. Hold on 1 second. So this puts us into my grandfather, Gene. All right, my grandfather, Gene, raised me like a daughter, right? And so I grew up hearing his stories of the grandfather who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, right? And my grandfather, Gene, had to, in 1938, he had to flee the country during World War II when Japan invaded China. So he landed straight into the detention facility in Seattle. So many of my questions when I was younger was I didn't understand how my grandfather wasn't accepted as an American, from being the grandson of somebody who had helped create this great architecture, that would help the United States, right? And so one of the things I was able to find, and it took a really long time to uncover it, is the Chinese Exclusion Act file for him. And hold on 1 second, sorry. Like many Chinese during the exclusion period, Grandpa Gene entered during the paper network, which was, the paper network is this elaborate scheme involving white smugglers, Chinese businessmen, lawyers, interpreters, men and women who would claim, that person, that's my son, right? Christians, allies who knew that the laws were wrong, who helped connect new arrivals to lawyers and contacts who could help get them through. I noticed that the Chinese Exclusion Act interrogations were getting longer and more complex as the decades went on. And in the case of my grandpa Gene, who entered during the latter years of Chinese exclusion, he has a file that is thick and is a complete and utter fiction. So one of the things that I was doing when I was first looking at this page, and I was showing it to my family, no one knew who the man on the left was. My grandfather Gene was a teenager. He was 16 years old. He was the handsome Lang Jai on the right. But nobody knew in my family who the guy on the left was. For the longest time, I was like, how can immigration officials really believe that this guy was my grandfather's father, right? And that's what this deposition says. This deposition says that, this person, Mr. Wong, came into the country on this date, right? And he came in as the son of a citizen. He left to go to China, got married, and had 4 sons. And this deposition says that my grandfather is Wang Sungming, or Sunming Wang, right? And he claims to be his son. And it took me a whole trip to China and visiting our villages before I was able to uncover, in fact, this man, who at first I thought looked nothing like my grandfather, was actually my grandfather's uncle. So this was actually very common, that you would buy papers from somebody who was either a family member or from your village, because a lot of the questions that are asked of you during the interrogation process are about the village. Where is the well in relation to your house? Where does your uncle live? Where do your grandparents live? That kind of thing. And it's much easier to answer correctly when you're actually from that village or you are related to that person. Let's see. Okay. So, oh, wait. Sorry. So let me talk to you about some of the problems that I had with the archives. So here's problem number 1 with the archives. Much of the local newspaper accounts, and I don't have them up right now, the newspaper accounts of those expulsions and the coverage of what happened to Chinese people afterwards, the local coverage was incredibly biased, right? For me, it was a real exercise in reading against the grain. And I found it impossible not to take personally because my family was here and they were being directly impacted, right, by these violent events. So on the one hand, I had lots of articles advocating for boycotts and expulsions or reports of nameless Chinese being attacked. Sometimes it was at night while they were sleeping. Sometimes it was workers who were working in camps, right? They were sleeping in tents. And sometimes people were pushed out of their brick and mortar homes. It was relentless. On the other hand, there were very few articles about the victims themselves. And when the narrative is that one-sided in the English language press, you know that writers yearn to seek out the real information and fill in those omissions, right? And gather those documents. So I learned many lessons in reading against the grain with the newspaper articles in the 1880s and the 1890s. And so what I did was I had to seek out other points of views to counter it. Chinese newspaper articles of that period, newspapers that were more balanced in terms of their points of views, and I had to pay careful attention to what Chinese folks said and the rare opportunities when they actually were quoted, because it was very rare. And the other thing I really had to really contend with was myself as the narrator, because I am a character in this book, and I knew that I had to be completely honest about the way that I was feeling, whether that was rage, grief, anguish, or marvel and awe at the things that people were able to, the resilience that people showed under this heavily discriminatory apparatus. All right. So problem number 2 with the archives. The Chinese Exclusion Act files are scattered all around the country. They're not easy to find. There's no one single central repository. These files could be in any of the cities where they lived, any of like the regional and national archives near where they lived. And once you do find those Chinese Exclusion Act files, you can get them scanned and sent to you, but I'm the kind of researcher that likes to go to the archives and see the archives with very, very own eyes. You notice things, right, that you can't when you just have something scanned. You can see watermarks. You can just notice texture photographs, what they look like without that kind of warping effect that occurs when you scan. So I needed to visit all of the National Archives offices where the Exclusion Act files on my family members were. So it was only after collecting the Chinese Exclusion Act files on each of my many family members who were characters in the books. I went to Boston, I went to the Bay Area and San Bruno, I went to Seattle, and of course I visited the New York NARA offices. It was only then that I realized, after I accumulated all of them, I realized that Chinese exclusion turns all of the golden rules of research on its head. So we all know that it's a commonly held general rule of thumb amongst us that it's the written record that is the gold standard for writers and historians, right? And the family stories that are generally suspect, right? They're dependent upon people's faulty memories, they're long on embellishment and tall tales. But here's the thing. When you're Chinese in America with roots that stretch back to the exclusion era, it is the historical record, those Chinese Exclusion Act documents, that is the great fabrication. And it's the oral stories passed down from generation to generation that ultimately holds the keys to the truth. So this realization for me opened up so many more possibilities about how to write this story. It gave me license to use the family stories that I collected from interviewing former residents of this building, people who knew our family, villagers, and the oral histories in combination with the archival research, newspaper articles where, again, I had to read against the grain, the Chinese Exclusion Act documents, which, were filled with half-truths, and build a story from there, right? Now, here's another question. How do you write a story about a marginalized community whose archives weren't deemed worthy of saving, right? Many of us are in this position, particularly if you write about people who are not rich and famous, all right? So in order to provide a fuller picture for the reader, I had to incorporate all of these many stories. I had to give these stories license to be heard, and I also had to provide my own personal point of view. And I can tell you that by far the hardest thing to uncover was the stories of the women, including my two great-grandmothers, both who were wives of merchants who emigrated, one legally, one illegally, across the Canadian border within 5 years of each other. So here's a photograph of my two great-grandmothers. The one on the left is my Chin great-grandmother. She's the one in the fancy hat. This family photograph, this portrait was taken in New York. What year is it? This is about 1917 or so. It's kind of a funny photograph, I think. I just, just seeing her in that hat is kind of funny. Anyway, she was, grew up, you can see she does not have bound feet. She was not considered an elite class. She was the fishmonger's daughter, and she married the third son of a once prestigious family that had really come down in life. That family, the Chin family, at the time had been descendants of Ming generals, 200 years of generals and under the Ming dynasty, and under the subsequent dynasty, the Qing dynasty, they were basically hired bodyguards and kung fu martial artists. And her husband on the right, I go into his immigration story, how he entered. He is a merchant, but it was difficult for him to enter because at the time, even though sometimes merchants were allowed into the country, what happened to him was the government only wanted to allow 2 merchant visas for our family business, and his 2 older brothers were occupying it, so he had to come in under other means. This is Chinan. He later becomes head of the Anlong Tong, which was the Merchants Association that was later, connected to many nefarious doings. And this is the side of my family that was spoken about in whispers. All right. On the right-hand side, my other grandmother, you can see there are 2 photographs of her. I'll just talk about the one all the way on the right. She is all the way on the right. She was trained as a midwife in Hong Kong, trained under the aegis of the London Missionary Society. These were midwives who were sent out by the colonial government in the turn of the century by around, this is about 1907 or so. And they were sent out basically to help women giving birth and also tasked with recording these births. This was really important because unfortunately, when some Chinese families had girls, those girl babies were at risk. So when the colonial government decided, send the midwife records their births. She is doing a service not just for the families, but also for these baby girls. She ends up marrying my great-grandfather, Shim, who this side of the family are Christian do-gooders, and this is not an arranged marriage. This was a marriage built on faith. Collective faith. They met at church. And the story was she was so beautiful. He saw her. His family had wanted him to, marry a village girl who had bound feet, who was not Christian. He took one look at her, singing over her Bible, her hymnal, and realized that this was the woman for him. So both of my great-grandmothers, they came into the country, again, one legally, one illegally. They became, in our building, upstairs and downstairs neighbors from each other. The one on the left lived on the 4th floor, was downstairs neighbor. The one on the right was the upstairs neighbor. In the beginning, they did not like each other. There was my great-grandmother, the one who was the midwife on the right-hand side. She was Hakka from Hong Kong. And the Hakka are a people, they are Chinese, but they are people who do not have their own land, right? So if you think of like Cantonese people, when you say, the Cantonese people have a language and they are from Canton, right? Shanghainese person speaks Shanghainese and they are from Shanghai. The Hakka were forced out of the northern part of China for like 3 or 4 times during the last millennia, and they wound up. Her family wound up in Hong Kong, where in the 19th century there were interethnic wars between the Hakka and the local Cantonese. So it was great distrust between the communities, and it continues even here on Mott Street. But that said, one of the things that happens when people become neighbors, these 2 women lived through the 1917 flu, the diphtheria epidemic, the loss of children, even the Tong Wars, which were this very violent period in Chinatown history that my Chin grandfather was involved in. When it was very bloody wars, there were hits on their husbands' heads. There were raids that happened in Chinatown because the government started conflating immigration with the Tong War violence, and they were not connected. But through their struggles, as neighbors, along with my great grandmother's great friendship, really for me was one of the great joys of working on this book. Being able to talk about and reveal their stories and write from their points of view, for me was everything. Um, so another question. Oops, hold on a second. Sorry, this happens. Okay. Um, One of my big questions was, how do you make 150 years of history come to life, right? It's daunting, but I believe that the answer is through characters that people find compelling, where you can write through their points of views. Um, Characters who, if you're lucky enough in your family, as I was able to. I had family members who existed and lived during all of those many periods throughout the Chinese exclusion era, right? From the building of the railroad, um, finally on to the repeal of Chinese exclusion. And here is just an image. I am often guided by images. As you saw, I make these little books. I've had to do these things through the years in order to really keep focused on the work. And here's just a panoply of the various family members here. So this book is the culmination of decades of research where I zigzagged my way across the globe and interviewed family, friends, and former residents of the building, gathering the oral histories and the documents and comparing it against the official record and seeing the holes that existed there. So, since the start of the pandemic, there have been thousands of instances of anti-Chinese violence in our country. This terrifying rise is, to my mind, a resurgence from our collective past. It makes this work of understanding and inclusion all the more vital. Telling the fuller story of Chinese in America, both our triumphs and our many disappointments, through the intimate lens of my family on Mott Street has been a massive undertaking and really an eye-opening privilege. Now, when I was growing up, I was taught never to air the dirty laundry. But it was only after doing this research that I realized that the story is much larger than just my father and myself. I realized that I had unwittingly uncovered a legacy of immigrant resilience in the face of discriminatory legislation, the larger untold stories of our contributions to this country, and ultimately what it means to be Chinese in America. I can't wait to take you along this journey. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop the share. Sydney.
Well, I wish everybody could be, I'm sure everybody is applauding. That was so wonderful, so interesting, and so moving, and actually quite enraging also. So thank you. I have about 10 questions that I wrote down while you were speaking, but I think we owe it to our audience to give you theirs. So let me just move the Q&A over so I can see you just a second. Just a second. So this is from Sandy Jimenez, and she said, I'm just going to read it because it's a long question. And you know Sandy? Okay, you know Sandy. Thank you for sharing the illuminating iterative journey of how you worked on the book directly and indirectly, art shows, other books, and other media forms in the years before taking on the big book on your family. My question is, were there rights complications, conflicts of consent after the fact issuing from the earlier works that led up to the book? Were you able to use everything that you wrote elsewhere or beforehand, or everything you wanted to use from those earlier efforts in other articles, other books, art shows, etc.? Or were there things unavailable to you despite the fact that you created them because they were owned by another publisher?
Right. That's a great question. And that was a concern when I first started working on it. I was like, have the copyright. I mean, eventually the copyright for your other books, your older books, reverts back to yourself. Um, but how much of that can you use, right? So what I decided to do was not lift passages from prior books, because it is absolutely true that with Split, I have an essay in there about meeting my dad for the first time. With Eating Wildly, there's a lot of information. There's information about my grandparents who raised me, Grandpa Gene, right? And Rose is the daughter of the midwife. Um, so I wrote a lot about them in Eating Wildly. But what I decided to do was anything that was really important for this book that the reader needs to know from my family background that I've written about before, I wrote from scratch again. So that might sound like, it's like, oh, so much work, right? And it is. But when you know that the work is important, you do it. So in that regard, there were no issues with copyright. From a legal standpoint, sometimes people ask me, well, you write about some things about your father, are you ever worried he's a lawyer, are you ever worried he's going to sue? And, I've written about him before and he has never sued, knock, knock wood. And he's now 91, so hopefully not. But, what do they say? The best prediction of future outcomes is looking at stuff that happened in the past. I got that wrong, but I got the gist of it. So there's that. Sydney, what other questions do you have?
Okay, thank you. Annie Tan, who I think you know also, she says, "Hi, Ava. I heard from the National Archives in New York that there are some places where there were fires, so some records are likely gone, but also that there's a certain time period where some records are sealed, at which time they're released, especially for deceased people. Before traveling to places like Boston, are there ways to check whether those files even exist in the first place before flying out? In other words, any timeline tips for genealogy seekers?"
Sure. So, okay. So here are two big tips. Um, the National Archives themselves, right, don't have a ton of money. So when you go, tip number one, when you go and you're looking for information, even if you this happened before I ever registered on Ancestry, um, they will tell you, okay, if you're looking for this file, go to that terminal right there. Go on Ancestry and look for the Chinese Exclusion Act number on Ancestry. Like they themselves, those offices use Ancestry to find the numbers of the document in order to help you find your documents, right? So what you can do, and this is not a plug for Ancestry by any means, but it is very helpful. And you can use Ancestry at the public library if you're in New York. You can go to the Milstein division at the Schwartzman Building on 42nd Street, Fifth Avenue, 42nd Street, and you can use it for free. So that's one tip. You can look up things via Ancestry, find the file number, Chinese Exclusion Act number for that office, jot that down and have that before you go. Then the second thing is, even before you go, it makes sense to reach out to the office because you can't just go and expect to get the file on that day. You have to reach out to them. You have to give them as much information as possible about that long deceased relative and the numbers that you find via Ancestry or any other searches that you do. Then they need to pull that file and they have to, I can't remember what the word is, but they have to approve it. They have to declassify. I can't remember what the term is, but they go through an official process to clear it so that you, as a member of the public, can look at those files. And there are there is that date. And where are we now? I can't, off the top of my head, it's been a while since I've looked for the files, because a lot of my research was done before the pandemic. And so I don't remember when the cutoff date is, but there's a certain year where, okay, you're clear and anybody can access those files. But prior to that, or prior to that year, or after that year, you can't access it. You have to wait. And the same thing with the Freedom of Information Act files, and that is done with USCIS, that has those central files. So in addition to the National Archives, you also have USCIS that has A files on the Chinese Exclusion Act A files, and that is when people naturalized, or if people were caught during the confession program in the 1950s, right? It becomes a federal case, or if someone gets arrested and it goes before a federal judge, you can get those records through USCIS, and you have to do a USCIS search. So those are like two paths on how to do your research. Sydney, what other questions do we have?
Oh, there's a lot of research questions, and I'm going to ask you a few, but I want to interject. Here's an easy and fun one from Alex Schulman. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. I wanted to know this too. Who are the young women behind your great grandmother on the picture on the far right? Your midwife great grandma. Like,
Oh, the pictures of the other midwives?
is that who they were? They were her trainees or
Yeah,
colleagues or
yeah,
something?
yes. So the middle person was Jane Stewart, who was the head of nursing. And in that picture, how I was able to determine that this was Nethersole Hospital was through Jane Stewart. You remember there was a white woman who was seated, who was wearing a very matronly, like a nursey outfit, and she had a belt buckle that was very specific to Nethersole Hospital. And so I sent that photograph off to researchers in Hong Kong who did like Hong Kong medical history research, and they were able to pinpoint the hospital, the time period, because of that head of nursing. The other women in the photograph are other second year trainees with my great grandmother, and one of them might be another sort of extended family member who wasn't related at the time, but came to New York during the same period, lived in the community, and because Chinese exclusion was so restrictive, there were so few women. There were so few families in that were able to get through, that what ends up happening is, back in the 19 teens and the 20s, people start marrying each other. So one of those other midwives might actually be my cousin's other great grandmother. My cousin's both great grandmothers might be in that picture. But anyway, that's kind of a long story. Other questions?
Lots of questions. Okay, this is from Mary Chapman. Hi, Ava. I'd love to hear how you navigated your language gaps. To research Chinese language sources, did you hire a translator? How did you decide whom to hire and whether or not they would have the kinds of sensitivity you would need for them to have?
Yeah. Hi, Mary. So it's a great question. I am very lacking in language skills. And so I had to learn to be resourceful. And so what that meant was, I had lots of people helping me, friends. I mean, family members, not so much, surprisingly. Everybody's really busy and they're like, oh, you and your little project, right? But largely friends helped out, both with the Chinese language papers, but also, with the Kishinev pogrom, I searched for the Yiddish language, the New York Yiddish press, that wrote about the Chinese fundraisers for the pogrom victims. So I had to hire people to translate and find. First, I had to hired people to find the Yiddish language articles and then translate them. And then the Chinese language translators, there were many. The best ones I found were Hong Kong Chinese, young Hong Kong Chinese who were in graduate school who had just graduated, because a lot of my documents were in traditional Chinese characters. So even my best students, so I also taught at Fudan University, which is like the Princeton of China, and and my best students, who are mainlanders and grew up with reading simplified Chinese, even they had a difficult time dealing with the genealogy documents that are handwritten and all in traditional characters. So the best ones really were the Hong Kongers who, know traditional characters. That's what they learn. Or I mean, I guess you could also, like, someone from Taiwan would be able to do the same thing. So I was able to find a really stellar translator, a young woman who was so impressive that I had to hire her on the spot. That was recommended through other people. So that was my translation help. Family, friends did help too, but mostly I had to hire people. Sydney, what else?
Okay, from Carla Kaplan. Thank you for a really wonderful talk. I very much appreciated what you said about the reversal of reliability in sources, that in this case, oral history is what can be trusted and not government documents. Were there times when you also felt you had to second guess your family sources or family histories when you felt those were not entirely reliable?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it there were those occasions, but you know what? I'm thinking of something else, which actually was not from my family, but I ended up writing about. Um, I found information about a woman in the 1880s who got forced out of her home, who was pregnant, and so this is the height of the Paihua, right? And mostly I based the scene off of the wonderful research that was done by historians like Beth Lou Williams, historians like Jeannie Failser, who was wonderful and allowed me to photocopy her entire archive about the Chinese expulsions, and then FedExed it back to her. So I really relied heavily on other researchers as well. And anyway, but in addition to that, I tried as best as possible to reach out to family members, descendants, to try to find out what their stories were. And so lately, what's happened is I talked to a descendant of the woman who was pregnant and forced out of her home, and he told me that it turned out that she was a merchant's wife. This merchant, through the course of his life, had 6 wives, and so I don't know if you know some of the if there are issues with some of the historical records, or that people's memories are faulty. And when you have 6 wives, I mean, there's a lot going on. And and then sometimes family members don't want to talk to you, right? So and maybe, I did have that happen a lot. Sorry, Carly. So here's another instance. I did not get a chance to write about this in the book, because what ended up happening is the book was getting longer and longer and longer. And I had to, and this is important about frame, right? You need to really stick to your frame. Otherwise, like, you can just go on and on and on. So there was a family story on my Chin side where at a certain point in time, brother turned against brother and a murder happened, right? Someone was poisoned. And at this point in the family story, the language employed becomes passive voice, right? A murder occurred. He was poisoned, right? And I have a family member here in New York who ended up giving me her genealogy document. And when she heard that I had heard through the grapevine that this had happened between the brothers, she's descendant from one of those brothers, I'm descendant from another. She was like, "Oh, well, I never heard that story." And, you couldn't your grandfather have been embellishing the truth, right? But I went to the villages and I asked them questions about the brothers, and it did turn out they explicitly said that one of the brothers had been poisoned, and that it was done by other family members. But when I asked them specifically who it was, they went, "Oh, I don't know. We don't know." Right. So definitely, people like to cover things up that don't make their family members look particularly good. In the end, as we all know, it really is up to you as the researcher and the writer to determine what you think is your best guess, estimate, based on the research that you've done of what the actual truth is. And that actually is really important for that. I know some of my biography and memoir students are out there. It's really important, and this is for all of us actually, it's really important to always remember, particularly in a work like this, narrative nonfiction, where your narrator yourself is a character, you are the lens through which the reader views the world. And so the reader needs to understand what you're feeling throughout the course of the book, like what your estimates are, even if you turn out to be dead wrong, right? And then you find out later, oh, actually, it turns out to be this later on in the narrative, right? They still need to know who you are. I mean, I had a long conversation with Vivian Gornick about this. For those of us who have read The Situation in the Story, like many of my graduate students have because I make them, Vivian makes it very clear that what you need to do is for the reader to understand who is this narrator, right? And why I should trust this narrator. And so your narrator is the guide through the story. And a story like this is very important that, my narrator guides you through, all of these generations, these eras in history. Sydney, what else do we
Well,
have?
also, I mean, you cite your sources and you're basically saying this is what I relied on,
Oh
and
yeah,
you
yeah,
can judge my judgment by looking at my sources as
right,
well.
exactly. There, even though this is a family biography and it was originally pitched as a memoir, but became more of a family biography. There are lots of sources. It is an extensive bibliography at the end.
Okay, this is an interesting question. We're very much focused on research, as you can see. There are some other questions, but I think these are really relevant. Rachel Greenfield writes, there are African historians I know who have talked about performative history taking precedence over written history, and in this case, they're talking about song and dance, not family stories. Are these part of the oral history for your family as well? And if so, what part did they play in the development of your history?
Well, so I was able to get that oral history of my grandfather, of which I am enormously grateful for the young historian who took that back in the 80s before my grandfather passed away. This was somebody who I was estranged from and I never got to meet, but I felt like I really could understand him more by hearing his voice and through these interviews. One of the things that came through actually was the food. So he writes an extensive amount about the food that we had brought in to our stores, food that roast pigs that they had made, and like building a pit, in the basement on, like across the street on Mott Street, you know, uh, how to make, how to make a salt baked chicken, recipe, like sort of like not actual recipes, but details about things that we made in when the family store became a coffee shop, like what were the things that were made there. So part of part of actually the fun of working on this book was not just asking folks about like the background history, family members, who's connected to whom, what did they do, bloody bloody, but also, well, what were your favorite things that your mother, your grandmother made for you. And I don't get that much into the culinary history in this book because it wasn't the focus of this book, but food definitely plays a part, right? Food is culture, and it is a way in which the women of the family can pass down their culture to the next generation. And one of the fun things that I was able to do was, I was really inspired by all of these things, these dishes, these various dishes that my family members wrote about. And so I started making a lot of these dishes for my child, who's now 10 years old and sometimes asks for these things. So that was fun.
Well, we know you're a professional food writer. So that there it is. Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. Eric Banks writes, "Hi, Ava. Can you say how the practical experience of the pandemic, especially time physically spent away from the work in the archives, which you've made clear was so crucial to the project, may have affected the ultimate evolution of the work?" But before you answer that, I want to add on, I was very interested in hearing about your research in China. So if it might be a related question, or you can answer, Eric, but
Sure.
answer
Okay.
too.
So I was lucky that I did the bulk of this research before the pandemic. So I started in 2015. That's when I made that decision that I was gonna do that book, right? And it was finally gonna happen, and it was gonna be my sole focus. Um, from that point forward, I applied for a Fulbright fellowship, landed it, brought the family to China. I did it so that we could be in country, right? I didn't land exactly where I thought that I was going to, but I was still at least I was only like a 2 hour plane ride away from our villages. And so the research in China was sort of twofold. It was to gather as many of the genealogy documents as possible. I was hoping to find stories of the women. Mostly I didn't. Most of the genealogy documents are, very patriarchal. And it's only like the male line that comes down. The only time you hear about like, a wife or a mom is because she gave birth to a son, right? I had to kind of just sort of keep those expectations in check. But I wanted to find all of the genealogy documents from each of our villages. And I also brought friends of mine who have better language skills than I do. And we went around and asked people who was the person who remembered the family. And people would like walk by. These are farmers, right? It's like rural farming villages in southern China. People will walk by like sugarcane, on their shoulders or whatever, like farming implements. And they would be like, "Oh yeah, your great grandfather Dosham. Yeah, he was a real patriot. He, donated, a plane during the war, during World War II, against the Japanese, right?" And then someone else would go, "A plane? He donated 7 planes." Like people, it was still part of people's living memory, which was really like amazing to me because great grandpa Dosham died, in the 1950s. I mean, that 1950s is not that long ago, but this was someone who looked like, he was maybe, not that much older than me. And like, how do they remember that, or how do they know that? And it's their oral history. It's part of their stories as well. Also, in these villages, our rural villages are dominated by generally one or two surnames. So in our Ang village, everybody there has the last name Ang. And so people are related in some way, shape, or form. So they still carry those stories with them. What else did you need to know? So genealogy documents, gathering stories from folks who still may remember family members. I had a hell of a time trying to find Dec Foon's family. His son, remember, he had a son by the first wife who passed away, and that son lived in Hong Kong. And I was looking. I went to like like a big banquet, like 900 people, like big Hong Kong banquet of Ang family, just all Ang people, and they were all like business people. And I was like trying to find these family members, couldn't find them. Um, I'll tell you a funny story. I did a presentation on Dec Foon for the 1882 Foundation in DC. 1882 Foundation was instrumental in getting Congress to apologize for the Chinese Exclusion Act law, right? Anyway, so I gave a talk there about Dec Foon and some of the things that he did. And it turned out that a year later, uh, someone descended from Dec Foon's line was living in DC, and her husband was like a chaplain at that Chinese American church that we did the presentation in. And that year, her family decided that all they knew was that great grandpa married an American woman and stayed in America, and they didn't know anything else, right? So we were able to find each other, and the summer of 2019, before the pandemic, that was the last time I went out to Hong Kong, and I met with Dec Foon's grandson, who just celebrated his 90th birthday, and then found out information about Dec Foon and Elva when they were living in Hong Kong. So that really helped round out that part of the book. Did I answer that question?
You answered my part. Now I should direct you back to Eric's, which was about the pandemic affecting it. And it sounds like you had.
Right. So I had done so much of the
Yeah.
research beforehand that by the time the pandemic hit, I needed to hunker down, and go through the research and really start weeding back, right? What was important and what wasn't important, and really trying to you know figure out how not to stand in the way of the narrative. So
I'm
during
impressed that you had the concept in 2015, and here you are. You've delivered a manuscript in 2022. That's fast for a project of that dimensions, as many of our members would agree.
Well, thank you, Sydney. But it did feel pressing, right?
Yes,
Because
right.
of the political situation that we find ourselves in, that started under the last presidency.
Okay, there's so many good questions here. I'm trying to. How about this was an early one that I did not get to, and this was about writing from Robin Pointer. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. Please talk a little more about what reading against the grain is like.
Reading against the grain is really, it was difficult. So there were so many times when I was reading these really, really vitriolic, really biased newspaper articles from the 19th century, and it started to really actually quite get to me, right? Um, and I write about it in the book, where I write about like reading these articles, and feeling like it was like a punch in the stomach, right? And how to, just sort of deal with that on the one hand, but also make my way through all of these articles, and also be honest with the reader about how I was feeling in that moment in time. Oftentimes, what would happen is like, I would just shut down. Whereas I remember being at the Cullman Center as a fellow, and I was like reading some of these horrific articles and just feeling like I needed to take a nap, right? And or I would feel really blue and I couldn't understand why. And then I was like, oh, it's because I've been like immersed in these materials. One of the most difficult things was, when you're reading these materials, was there were many of these articles from the West Coast that were decidedly anti-Chinese. Um, Often the editorial boards were directed by people or owned by people who were politicians, and being anti-Chinese was incredibly popular at that time. So it was an easy way to get votes, right, and to drum up people's knee-jerk reactions. And so sometimes the work was just like, incredibly biased, but other times it was just, 54 Chinese miners attacked in their sleep in Carbonado, Washington, right? And I was like, who are these people? Who are these sons and brothers and fathers, who crossed an ocean to get here, to find work and then get attacked? Like, who are these people? And of course, in the English language press, there was like no information. And so one of the challenges of writing about that time period was like, how do you fill in those stories? Like, who controls the narrative, right? And when I'm reading those articles, well, those writers and those newspaper owners control the narrative. Well, then, no, the researcher of today has to go further and push further and find those voices. And so a friend of mine at the Coleman Center was like, look, you're writing about these expulsions. Why don't you see how other people write about other expulsions? Why don't you see how writers and historians have written about the early pogroms of the 20th century, right? And so I was, the Kishinev pogroms were, of course, one of the first places that I looked because my family members had done those fundraisers, right? So I was very aware of it. And so I read the book pogrom, and then I was also looking at newspaper articles. And what I realized is that, so the Kishinev pogroms were like devastating because they were the first pogroms of the 20th century, and people were shocked. It was like called the shot that was heard around the world, right? And it also dovetailed with the advent of photography. And so with that pogrom, you had attacks on whole families, you had attacks on women, you had attacks on children. And that's when I realized that, maybe, I don't know how this sounds, right? Maybe it sounds like mercenary. But that for a reader to read about attacks on laboring men who you don't have any context about, you don't even know their names, it's different than if you hear of an attack on a pregnant woman who was forced out of her home by her hair, right? When you hear a story like that, then something happens to you. It happens to me as a writer, but it happens to you as a reader, right? And what I realized too is that the pogroms that happened in the 1880s and 1890s against Chinese, there were no photographs. There were some line illustrations, but there were no photographs. And what I had to do was then to find the testimony. It wasn't testimony from the women themselves, but there was testimony from their husbands. They did not talk to the newspapers because, of course, the newspapers were so biased, and Chinese people were worried about getting attacked again. So, but there was testimony. There were federal government investigations, and the testimony about what happened to these women then made it into the official record there. And then from there, I was able to craft a narrative about what happened during that time.
It's a huge undertaking. Of course, you realize we've run over a little bit, but
I
I
know we
think
have.
it's okay with CUNY. There's questions that I couldn't get to. Is there a place where people could write to you and ask their questions? I don't know whether that's possible at this point, since you're teaching writing, et cetera,
Yeah.
or not.
Right. I guess if you like right now, I'm incredibly
You can.
busy.
I know.
But of course, I am a professor at CUNY, and my work email is is there. So if someone really has a pressing question and needs to email me, they totally can. I can't promise that I'll be able to email
Right.
you back right
Right.
away.
Yeah, right. Let me say this to those of you. I'll intercede for Ava and say she'll do her best, but she's got a day job and blah, 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 blah. So she'll do her best. So thank you so very much. It was so moving and so helpful, I think, to a lot of people. We loved it. We've learned so much, and I know I speak for everybody on this Zoom or whatever it is that we can't wait to read the book. So keep going and congratulations and thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's a pleasure.